there's a well-known saying from a particular business tycoon, which went something like this: don't let love blind you from the money. Don't let love blind you from the money. In other words, if you want to make as much money as you possibly can, don't get entangled in relationships, because they're going to be a hurdle which will get in the way of you making as much money as you possibly can. Now, that might seem like a good life phrase to live by if your goal is to make as much money as you can. But as Christians, it's probably a pretty bad phrase to live by, because our ultimate goal shouldn't be just to make as much money as we can. Our ultimate goal is in fact love, is in fact relationships. And so for the Christian, it would be better to actually reverse that saying, wouldn't it? Don't let money get in the way or hinder your relationship. And that's a warning we would do well to heed in 1 Kings chapter 6. Because in this chapter we see the building of the temple. Now, what strikes you as you read this chapter is that this is a magnificent building. It's lavish, it's filled with wealth and resource. It's an impressive building. Tons of money would be invested into building this great place for God's presence to dwell. Yet don't let that distract you from what the temple is ultimately about: God's holiness and God's desire for relationship with his people. You might remember where we've come from in the book of 1 Kings. In the last chapter, in chapter 5, we were reminded that King Solomon wanted to build a temple for the Lord. It was something his father David, who was on the throne prior to him, wanted to do but was unable to do so. And so Solomon got the planning for the temple underway. He invested the help of the king of Hiram, one of his father's old friends, who was going to get the Sidonians to cut timber for him. And now at the start of chapter 6, well, the building of the temple is well underway. And as you read from verse 1, you'll see that the author actually gives us what seems like a random piece of historical context. He says in verse 1 that these events are taking place 480 years after the Exodus. And that's not just a throwaway random piece of context. Actually, once again, it's the author of 1 Kings reminding us that God is being faithful to his old promises. Because a number of promises were made to God's people back in Exodus. For example, he promised that he would lead them into a particular land in Exodus 3 verse 8. Similarly, in Exodus 6 verse 7, we were told that God was going to be with his people. He was going to dwell with his people and be their God. And now, 480 years later, we're given this little reminder from the author of 1 Kings that God is being true to his promises. Now in 1 Kings chapter 6, we see that the people of Israel, they are dwelling in the capital of the land that God promised them, and they are now embarking on this project to build a temple, a place where God would dwell with his people. And so once again, God is being faithful to his promises in building this temple, and this temple, as you read through this chapter, you'll see is absolutely glorious. God provides all the amazing, extravagant resources that are to be used. He gives King Solomon the specifications to build the temple, and you'll see in verse 38 that King Solomon follows them to a T. And this chapter you could really break up into two sections. Verses 1 to 10 talks about the external structure of the temple, and then kind of verses 14 through to 38 we see the internal structure of the temple. And if you take that as kind of like a sandwich, that's kind of like the top piece of bread and the bottom piece of bread, but what comes between them is verses 11 through to 13, and that's almost like the meat in the sandwich. It's the high point of the passage. It's the high point of the chapter, which reminds us what the temple was ultimately about. It wasn't just a beautiful spectacle for people to look through. It wasn't a tourist attraction. No, it was ultimately about relationship, a means through which God could dwell with his people. Look with me from verse 11 through to 13. It says, "Then the Lord gave this message to Solomon. Concerning this temple you are building, if you keep all my decrees and regulations and obey all my commands, I will fulfill through you the promise I made to your father David. I will live among the Israelites and will never abandon my people, Israel." There's a lot we can learn from 1 Kings chapter 6. Let me just pull out really briefly 4 things you could take away today. Firstly, as we've already said, we're reminded of God's faithfulness. That's the whole idea behind referencing Exodus. Once again, 1 Kings is reminding us that God is being faithful to his promises, even years after he made them. But secondly, we see something about God's glory. Why is this temple so extravagant? Why is so much money pumped into building this astonishing, beautiful building for God? Well, it's to give us a picture as to just how holy and majestic and magnificent he really is. He's awesome, he's great. Just as the temple would take your breath away, so God, to an infinitely greater degree, will take your breath away. He's that awesome and powerful. And so, to create a place of worship for God is costly, because worship is costly. And we live in the new covenant. There's no temple for us to gather in to worship God, but that principle is equally true for our lives. Our worship is oftentimes costly. I wonder at what point in your life or what area of your life right now does worship feel costly? Maybe it comes at the expense of a relationship, or the expense of your reputation, or the expense of money. Perhaps you wonder, is God worth it? Let the temple be a reminder to you that worship ought to be costly. God is worth it. Third thing we're reminded of as we read this passage is that worship should be carried out not according to our terms and conditions, but according to God's terms and conditions. Not only does God ask Solomon to build the temple, but he actually tells him how to build the temple. The temple was built upon God's specifications, and Solomon followed them out to a T. God doesn't just call us to worship him. He actually, quite often in the New Testament, tells us how to worship him. But fourthly and finally, as we look at the central portion of this chapter, we're reminded, aren't we, that God desires to dwell with his people. That's what the temple was ultimately about. God's desire to dwell with his people and his desire for obedience from his people. That's the center of this chapter. It's the center of the temple. And I wonder, is it the center of your life?